The radio was quiet for hours, until the single mom's A-10 called, "Mission complete." The operations center at Bagram Airfield had fallen into that particular kind of silence that precedes disaster. Controllers sat motionless before their displays, headsets pressed tight against their ears, listening to static that should have been punctuated by radio checks, situational updates, the routine confirmations that meant someone was still alive out there. The clock on the wall read 1847 hours. The sun was setting over the Hindu Kush, painting the mountains in shades of blood orange and deep purple, and somewhere in those ridges, 37 Marines were fighting for their lives against an enemy force that had materialized from the rocky landscape like vengeful spirits. The Quick Reaction Force had been pinned down for 6 hours. Apache gunships had expended their ordnance and returned to base with battle damage. An AC-130 gunship had been driven off by a concentration of anti-aircraft fire, so intense it had shredded one engine and killed 2 crew members. F-16s had made gun runs until their ammunition was exhausted, their pilots' voices growing increasingly desperate as they reported enemy reinforcements still pouring into the valley. The Marines on the ground had stopped requesting air support. They were now requesting evacuation of casualties, then just evacuation, and finally, in a transmission that made hardened officers look away from their screens, last rites. The Air Operations Center had gone through every available asset. They'd recalled aircraft from patrol sectors 300 miles away. They'd scrambled reserves that were supposed to be standing down for maintenance. Nothing could survive in that valley long enough to make a difference. The Taliban had chosen their ground perfectly, a narrow defile where the mountains rose so steeply that attack angles were nearly vertical, where the thermals were so violent they'd already claimed one helicopter, where every cave and crevasse concealed fighters with weapons that had been killing American aircraft since the Soviet invasion. Then a woman's voice came through the static, calm as someone ordering coffee, with a southwestern drawl that seemed impossibly out of place in this moment of catastrophic desperation. "Bagram Operations, this is Hog 27. I'm 15 minutes out from last known position of Dagger Company. Request immediate tactical update and clearance for close air support. I've got a full combat load and 4 hours of playtime." The operations officer, a lieutenant colonel named Vickers who'd flown Hornets in Desert Storm, actually pulled his headset away from his ear and stared at it like it had betrayed him. He keyed his microphone with the careful deliberation of someone who doesn't want to believe what he's hearing. "Hog 27, be advised you're a single ship responding to a danger-close situation with extreme enemy air defense activity. Multiple fast movers have already taken battle damage. We have no SCAD support available and no backup on station." The response came back without hesitation, and there was something in that voice that made everyone in the operations center stop what they were doing and listen. "Bagram, I'm aware. I heard the radio traffic. That's why I'm going in. Those Marines have been alone long enough." Vickers looked at his deputy, a major who'd been frantically checking the aircraft roster, trying to figure out where this A-10 had come from, why it wasn't on the schedule, who'd authorized its launch. The major shook his head slowly, his face pale in the blue glow of the tactical displays. "Sir, she's not even supposed to be flying today. Captain Raina Cahill. She was on crew rest after a night mission. Someone said she heard the radio traffic in the ready room and just walked out to the flight line." Vickers felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd been in this business long enough to know the difference between courage and suicide, and right now he wasn't sure which category this fell into. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately called the Warthog, was a plane designed for exactly this kind of mission, built around a cannon so powerful it could saw tanks in half, armored like a flying bathtub, slow enough to actually see what it was shooting at. But even Warthogs weren't invincible, and sending a single aircraft into a valley that had already chewed up and spit out everything they'd thrown at it felt less like tactics and more like sacrifice. He keyed his mic again. "Hog 27, can you confirm you understand the tactical situation? We have multiple reports of shoulder-fired missiles, truck-mounted anti-aircraft artillery, and possible MANPADS in the target area. The voice that came back was patient, almost gentle, like a teacher explaining something to a child who wasn't quite getting it. Bagram, I've been flying hogs for 11 years. I know what I'm getting into. I also know that Dagger Company has families waiting for them, same as I've got 2 kids waiting for me back at base housing. Difference is, I've got a 30mm cannon and a full load of Mavericks, and right now that makes me the best chance those Marines have. Now are you going to clear me in, or am I going to have to declare an emergency and do this without your blessing? Vickers closed his eyes for a moment. In his peripheral vision, he could see the feed from a Predator drone circling high above the valley, its thermal camera showing the desperate situation on the ground. The Marines had formed a defensive circle on a rocky outcrop, their position marked by the cooling bodies of the dead, and wounded they'd pulled into the center of their perimeter. Enemy fighters were moving through the surrounding ridges like wolves around a wounded elk, preparing for a final assault as darkness fell. He opened his eyes and made the decision that would either save 37 lives or add 1 more to the casualty list. Hog 27, you're cleared for close air support. Call sign for ground commander is Dagger 6. They're on emergency frequency. God help you, Captain. There was a pause, and when Raina Cahill spoke again, her voice carried something that might have been a smile. He usually does, sir. Hog 27 is inbound hot. Time to work. The A-10 Thunderbolt II that screamed over the mountain ridgeline at 400 knots and 300 feet above the deck was painted in standard camouflage gray. But there was nothing standard about the way it moved. Where other aircraft approached combat zones with the cautious deliberation of surgeons preparing for a delicate operation, this Warthog came in like a brawler crashing through a saloon door, confident and aggressive and utterly unafraid. Raina Cahill sat in the cockpit surrounded by switches and displays that would have looked outdated to pilots flying in Vietnam, her hands moving across the controls with the unconscious precision of someone who'd merged with her aircraft so completely that thinking and doing had become the same thing. She'd been 3 months old when her father, a Marine gunnery sergeant, had died in Beirut. She'd been 17 when she'd forged his signature on her Air Force enlistment papers, determined to fly the plane that provided close air support to Marines, the plane that might have saved her father if it had been overhead that day. She'd been 23 when she'd graduated at the top of her A-10 flight school class, 25 when she'd flown her first combat mission over Baghdad, 28 when she'd gotten pregnant with her first daughter, and been told by a squadron commander that maybe it was time to think about a desk job. She was 34 now, and she'd spent every one of those years proving that she belonged in this cockpit, that being a mother didn't make her any less of a warrior, that the best close air support pilot in the wing just happened to be a Hawaiian woman who barely cleared 5'3" and had to sit on a cushion to see over the instrument panel. The radio crackled to life with a voice that sounded like it had been dragged across broken glass. Any aircraft, this is Dagger 6. We are in extremis. Multiple wounded, low on ammunition, enemy preparing final assault. If anyone is listening, we need help now. Raina switched to the ground frequency, her voice cutting through the Marine's desperation with calm authority. Dagger 6, this is Hog 27, with full combat load. I'm 2 minutes from your position. I need you to mark your location and give me target coordinates. There was a pause, and she could almost hear the disbelief in the Marine's voice when he responded. Hog 27, confirm you're a single ship. We've got anti-aircraft fire across the entire valley. They've been shooting at everything that moves. Raina was already scanning the ridgelines through her targeting pod, her eyes picking out the heat signatures of weapon emplacements, the clustered shapes of enemy fighters moving into assault positions, the desperate handful of Marines huddled on their rocky perch like the last defenders of the Alamo. Dagger 6, I'm aware of the air defense situation. That's why they sent the Warthog. Now pop smoke and get your heads down. This is going to get loud. She armed her cannon, the GAU-8 Avenger, 7 barrels of pure destruction capable of firing 65 depleted uranium rounds per second, each round capable of punching through the armor of a tank. The Warthog had been built around this gun rather than the other way around, and when it fired, the recoil was so powerful it actually slowed the aircraft down, like a dragon breathing fire that pushed against its own wings. The Marines popped orange smoke, and Reyna saw it drifting up from their position, a bright beacon in the gathering darkness. She also saw the muzzle flashes of enemy positions surrounding them, a constellation of hostile fire that would have made any sane pilot reconsider their approach. Reyna Cahill had never been accused of being sane. She dropped the nose of her and dove into the valley like a hunting hawk, her airspeed building, her targeting reticle settling on the first cluster of enemy positions. The anti-aircraft fire started immediately, tracers arcing up through the darkening sky like deadly fireworks, and Reyna flew through it with the calm concentration of someone who'd done this so many times that fear had become just another piece of data to be processed and dismissed. "Dagger 6, guns, guns, guns," she called and squeezed the trigger. The Warthog shuddered as the Avenger opened up with its distinctive sound, a roar like an enormous chainsaw tearing through metal, a brrrrrrrt that echoed off the mountains, and announced to everyone in the valley that the cavalry had arrived. Depleted uranium rounds sleeted down onto the enemy position at 3,000 rounds per minute, each burst carefully controlled, 3-second trigger pulls that turned rock outcroppings into fountains of disintegrating stone and shredded metal. Reyna pulled up hard, her body pressed into her seat by the G-forces, and immediately rolled into another attack run, this time from a different angle, never giving the enemy gunners time to track her, always moving, always attacking, turning her single aircraft into what seemed like an entire squadron through sheer aggression and skill. "Hog 27, you're taking fire from your 7 o'clock. The Marines' warning came too late to matter. Reyna had already seen the tracers, already adjusted her angle, already calculated that the shooter was using a weapon that couldn't elevate fast enough to track her if she stayed in a hard turn. She rolled inverted and came screaming back down the valley upside down, her targeting pod locked onto a technical truck with a heavy machine gun mounted in the bed, the crew frantically trying to traverse their weapon to follow her impossible maneuver. "Guns," she said calmly, and fired another burst. The technical disappeared in a cloud of shredded metal and smoke. She rolled upright and climbed, her eyes constantly scanning her displays, her threat warning receiver screaming at her about missile locks and radar acquisitions, her hands and feet working the controls with the smooth precision of a concert pianist. This was what she'd been born to do. This was what all the years of training, all the mockery from pilots who thought women didn't belong in fighters, all the whispered comments about how being a mother meant she'd lost her edge, had been preparing her for. She thought about her daughters, 5 and 7 years old, who'd kissed her goodbye that morning not knowing their mom was going to end up in a valley in the Hindu Kush fighting for the lives of 37 Marines she'd never met. She thought about her father, dead before she could remember him, and wondered if this was how he'd felt in those final moments in Beirut, knowing that someone had to stand between the enemy and the people depending on him for protection. Then she stopped thinking about anything except the next target, the next approach, the next burst of cannon fire. There would be time for reflection later. Right now there was only the mission. The battle developed into a rhythm, a deadly dance between the lone and the enemy forces that had thought they had the Marines cornered. Reyna would dive into the valley, her aircraft silhouetted against the darkening sky, draw the anti-aircraft fire toward herself. And in the moment when every enemy gunner was focused on bringing down the Warthog, she would destroy them with precisely aimed cannon fire or AGM-65 Maverick missiles that turned weapon emplacements into smoking craters. She was using herself as bait, deliberately making herself the most attractive target in the valley, pulling the enemy's attention away from the Marines on the ground. It was working, but it was also unsustainable. Even the heavily armored A-10 could only take so much damage, and Reyna was starting to see warning lights illuminate on her instrument panel, felt the aircraft handling just slightly differently, heard sounds that shouldn't be there mixed in with the roar of her engines. Her right engine was running hot. Something had punched through her left wing, affecting her roll rate. Her hydraulic pressure was dropping slowly but steadily. None of it mattered. The Marines on the ground were still alive, and as long as she could keep flying, she was going to keep them that way. Hog 27, Dagger 6, you're a goddamn angel. We've got enemy forces withdrawing from the eastern ridge. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Raina allowed herself a tight smile as she rolled in for another attack run. Dagger 6, I'm just getting warmed up. How's your ammunition situation? The Marine's voice was grim. We're down to our last magazines. If you can't keep them off us, they're going to overrun our position in the next assault. Raina checked her own ammunition status. She'd expended half her cannon rounds and 3 of her Mavericks. She had enough for maybe another 15 minutes of sustained combat, and then she'd be flying a gun platform with no gun, a situation that would turn her from a predator into prey. She keyed her mic to respond, but before she could speak, her threat warning receiver went from its steady warning tone to a continuous scream. Missile launch. Not the shoulder-fired weapons she'd been dodging all evening, but something bigger, something that had been waiting for the perfect moment to engage. An SA-7 or SA-14, probably, launched from a concealed position, now tracking her across the sky with the mindless determination of a machine designed for one purpose only. Raina didn't panic. Panic was what got pilots killed. Instead, she punched out chaff and flares, climbed hard while turning into the missile to minimize her heat signature, and calmly calculated whether she could evade the threat or if this was the moment when her luck ran out. The missile streaked past her left wing close enough that she could see it through her canopy, a telephone pole with fins and a seeker head, missing her by less than 50 feet before its proximity fuse detonated and sent shrapnel sleeting through the air. The Warthog shuddered as fragments punched through her fuselage, and Raina heard the master caution alarm sound, felt the aircraft yaw to the left as something important broke. Her right engine was on fire. The temperature gauge was redlining. The fire warning light was glowing like an angry red eye, and she could see actual flames in her mirrors, streaming back from the engine nacelle like a demonic banner. Standard procedure was to shut down the damaged engine, activate the fire suppression system, and immediately head for the nearest airfield. Standard procedure was written by people who weren't trying to keep 37 Marines alive in a valley full of enemies who would show no mercy to prisoners. Raina left the burning engine running, diverted fire suppression foam into the nacelle, and rolled into another attack run. She'd fly on one engine if she had to. She'd fly on none if the Warthog would glide long enough to kill a few more enemies. She was absolutely not leaving until those Marines were safe or she was dead, and she was pretty sure the Warthog could absorb a lot more damage before the latter became inevitable. Dagger 6, I'm still in the fight. Give me targets. The Marine's voice was different now, stripped of the professional detachment that soldiers used to cope with fear, raw with something that might have been awe. Hog 27, you're on fire. Your entire right engine is burning. You need to get out of here. Raina's voice was gentle but absolutely firm. Dagger 6, I appreciate your concern, but I'm a big girl and I know what my airplane can take. Now I've got a gun that still shoots and missiles that still fly, so stop worrying about me and start giving me targets. Where do you need the hate? The Marine gave her coordinates, and Raina set up for what might be her last attack run. The Warthog was handling like a truck with a flat tire now, sluggish and unresponsive, fighting her on every input. The fire in her right engine was getting worse despite the suppression system. Her left engine was showing signs of sympathetic damage, temperature creeping up, oil pressure dropping. She had maybe 5 minutes before she'd have to choose between ejecting and attempting a dead stick landing in hostile territory, and neither option seemed particularly attractive. But 5 minutes was enough time to make a difference. 5 minutes was enough time to kill a lot of people who needed killing. She armed her last 3 Mavericks, selected all 3 for a ripple fire launch, and dove back into the valley one more time. The enemy had learned to recognize the sound of her engines now. and as she came screaming down from the ridge line, every weapon in the valley opened up on her simultaneously. It was like flying through a thunderstorm made of bullets and rockets, tracers crisscrossing the sky in patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't designed to kill her. Raina flew through it all with her teeth clenched and her hands steady on the stick, ignoring the hammer blows of rounds punching through her aircraft, focused only on the targeting reticle and the cluster of enemy positions that represented the greatest threat to the Marines below. Dagger 6, Mavericks away. Get your people down. She fired all 3 missiles in quick succession, the Warthog lurching upward as 1,000 pounds of ordnance dropped from her wings. The missiles streaked away trailing smoke, their seekers locked onto the heat signatures of enemy vehicles and weapon emplacements, and Raina pulled up hard, climbing out of the valley as her missiles found their targets and detonated in a string of explosions that lit up the mountainside like a fireworks display. Behind her, the enemy assault collapsed. The combination of her sustained attacks and the final devastating missile strike had broken whatever cohesion the Taliban fighters had maintained. Those who could withdrew into the mountains, dragging their wounded with them, abandoning their weapons and their dead in their haste to escape the Warthog's guns. The Marines on the ground watched in stunned silence as their attackers melted away into the darkness, and for the first time in 6 hours, no one was shooting at them. Raina climbed out of the valley into clearer air, her burning engine finally giving up the ghost with a bang that she felt through her seat. She shut it down properly this time, went through the single-engine failure checklist with hands that were starting to shake now that the immediate danger was past, and assessed her situation with the cold objectivity of a pilot who knew exactly how much trouble she was in. Her left engine was running, but barely. She'd lost most of her hydraulic fluid, which meant her flight controls were operating on backups that wouldn't last long. Her fuel was lower than it should be, suggesting she had a leak somewhere. Her aircraft was shot full of holes, literally ventilated like Swiss cheese, and it was only the Warthog's legendary toughness that had kept her flying this long. She needed to get on the ground, and she needed to do it soon, before the remaining engine quit or the backup hydraulics failed or any of the other 1,000 things that could go wrong on a battle-damaged aircraft decided to make her day even more interesting. She keyed her radio to the ground frequency one last time. Dagger 6, this is Hog 27. Enemy forces have withdrawn from your position. You should have air support inbound to cover your extraction. It's been an honor to serve with you Marines. The Marine's voice was thick with emotion. Hog 27, you saved our lives. We owe you everything. What's your status? Raina looked at her instrument panel, at the warning lights that were illuminating one by one like a Christmas tree decorated by an angry electrician, and decided that honesty was probably not the best policy in this case. I'm doing fine, Dagger 6. Just going to head back to base and get a few things patched up. You boys take care of yourselves. She switched to the Bagram frequency before the Marine could ask any more questions. Bagram operations, this is Hog 27. Mission complete. 37 Marines still alive. I'm RTB with battle damage and single-engine operation. Going to need emergency equipment standing by. Lieutenant Colonel Vickers's voice came back immediately, and Raina could hear the relief in it mixed with something else, something that sounded like respect. Hog 27, roger your battle damage. All emergency equipment is being positioned. We're clearing all other traffic. The field is yours. Can you make it back? Raina looked out at the darkening sky, at the mountains that still separated her from safety, at the instruments that were giving her less and less useful information as systems continued to fail. She thought about her daughters, about the promise she'd made to them that morning to be home for dinner, a promise that was looking increasingly unlikely to keep. She thought about her father and wondered if he'd had time to be scared before the end. Then she pushed all of it aside and focused on flying, because that was all that mattered now. Bagram, I didn't come this far to quit now. I'm bringing my hog home. The flight back to Bagram was the longest 40 minutes of Raina Cahill's life. Every mile was a negotiation with an aircraft that was held together by determination and the engineering genius of the Fairchild Republic Company. which had designed the A-10 to survive exactly this kind of punishment, but probably hadn't expected any pilot to push it quite this far. Her remaining engine was running rough, coughing and sputtering like an old man with pneumonia, the temperature gauge creeping steadily upward despite her best efforts to baby the throttle. Her backup hydraulics were failing, which meant her flight controls were getting mushier by the minute, requiring more and more input to achieve smaller and smaller responses. She was losing altitude gradually, but inevitably, the Warthog simply unable to maintain level flight on one damaged engine while carrying the weight of all the battle damage she'd accumulated. Raina did the math and calculated that she'd reach Bagram with about 500 feet of altitude to spare, which would be enough if nothing else went wrong, and barely survivable if it did. She flew with her hands light on the stick and her attention divided between her instruments and the terrain below, looking for flat places where she could attempt an emergency landing if the engine quit completely, knowing that any landing she walked away from would be a good one. But that landing in the mountains at night in a crippled aircraft would probably not fall into that category. The radio was full of voices now, controllers coordinating her approach, emergency crews positioning themselves along the runway, other pilots who'd heard about her mission calling in encouragement and offering to fly escort if she needed it. She appreciated the sentiment but declined the escort. The last thing she needed was another aircraft nearby when she was flying something that was barely responding to control inputs and could turn into a fireball at any moment. A-27 Bagram Tower. We have you on radar. You're 40 miles out. How's your aircraft handling? Raina considered sugarcoating the truth and decided that the people trying to save her life deserved to know what they were dealing with. Tower, she's flying like a grand piano with one wing and an attitude problem. I've got partial control authority, one engine that's ready to quit, and enough warning lights to host a rave. But she's still flying, and I'm going to put her on your runway or die trying. There was a pause, and then the tower controller's voice came back, and it was different now, stripped of the professional detachment that controllers usually maintained. A-27, we've got the entire fire department standing by, every emergency vehicle on base, and about 300 people watching on the flight line. You bring that hog home, Captain. We'll take care of the rest. Raina felt her throat tighten and forced herself to focus. Emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford until she was on the ground. She fine-tuned her approach, adjusting for the crosswind and her aircraft's tendency to want to roll left, setting up for a straightened landing because anything else would be asking too much of an airplane that had already given everything it had. The lights of Bagram appeared on the horizon, a constellation of civilization in the darkness of Afghanistan, and Raina aimed for them like a moth drawn to flame. Her engine coughed twice, and for a heart-stopping moment she thought it was going to quit entirely, but it caught again and kept running, protesting but still functioning, giving her just enough power to maintain her glide path. A-27, you're on final approach. Landing gear. Raina had been dreading this moment. Lowering the landing gear would require hydraulic pressure she wasn't sure she had, and if the gear came down asymmetrically or failed to lock, she'd have to abort and try an emergency extension, which would cost her altitude she couldn't afford to lose. She reached for the gear handle and pulled, felt the aircraft shudder as the gear doors opened and the wheels started to deploy, watched the indicator lights like a gambler watching a roulette wheel, and finally, miraculously, saw all 3 lights show green. Tower, 3 green lights. Gear is down and locked. The relief in the controller's voice was palpable. A-27, you're cleared to land. Winds are 270 at 8 knots. Field is yours. Raina made her final corrections, fought the Warthog's tendency to drop the left wing, ignored the stream of warning tones and alarms that had become a constant background noise, and focused on the only thing that mattered: getting 35,000 pounds of battle-damaged aircraft onto the runway in one piece. The ground rushed up to meet her, the Warthog descending in a barely controlled glide, and at the last moment when she could see the individual lights marking the runway threshold, Raina pulled back on the stick and held the nose up as the main wheels kissed the concrete with a squeal of tires and a jolt that she felt through her entire body. She'd made it. She was down. The Warthog rolled down the runway trailing smoke from its damaged engine, and Raina gently applied the brakes, steering with what little control authority she had left, and finally brought her aircraft to a stop about halfway down the runway. She shut down the remaining engine, went through the post-flight checklist with fingers that wouldn't quite work properly, and then just sat there in the cockpit for a moment, listening to the silence. The emergency vehicles swarmed her aircraft immediately, fire trucks surrounding the Warthog and hosing down the smoking engine, emergency crews positioning ladders and preparing to extract her if necessary. Raina popped the canopy and fresh air rushed in, cool and clean and tasting like life. She pulled off her helmet, ran a hand through her sweat-soaked hair, and tried to stand up. Her legs didn't want to cooperate. The adrenaline that had kept her functioning through the mission was draining away, leaving her shaky and weak. A crew chief appeared at the side of her cockpit, his face pale in the floodlights. "Captain Cahill, can you move? Are you injured?" Raina shook her head and forced herself to stand, ignoring the way her hands were trembling. "I'm fine. Just give me a second." She climbed out of the cockpit on legs that felt like rubber, used the ladder more for support than anything else, and finally reached the ground. The moment her boots touched concrete, she turned to look at her aircraft, and what she saw made her breath catch. It looked like it had been through a shredder. There were holes in both wings, punctures in the fuselage, one engine that was a charred ruin and another that was barely better. The tail section was ventilated with bullet holes. One of the ailerons was hanging by a few bolts. It was a miracle the aircraft had flown at all, much less carried her through combat and brought her home. She reached out and touched the fuselage, feeling the still warm metal under her palm, and whispered a quiet thank you to the engineers who'd built this magnificent bastard of an airplane. A voice behind her made her turn. Lieutenant Colonel Vickers was walking toward her, and behind him, Raina saw what looked like half the base assembled on the flight line, people who'd come out to watch her land, to bear witness to whatever was going to happen. Vickers stopped in front of her and for a moment just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, and his voice carried clearly in the night air. "Captain Cahill, I need to tell you something. When you took off on this mission, I thought I was sending you to your death. I thought you were either crazy or suicidal, and I wasn't sure which was worse. I was wrong." He paused, and Raina saw his jaw tighten. "What you did tonight was the most extraordinary piece of flying I've witnessed in 30 years of military service. You went into a situation that had defeated every other aircraft we sent in. You did it alone, in an airplane that should have crashed 3 times over, and you kept 37 Marines alive through sheer skill and courage. You are the best goddamn close air support pilot I've ever seen, and I need you to know that." Raina felt her eyes starting to sting and blinked hard. She was not going to cry in front of her commanding officer and half the base. "Sir, I was just doing my job. Those Marines needed help, and I had a plane that could give it to them." Vickers shook his head. "No, Captain. What you did tonight was so far beyond doing your job that there isn't even a term for it. You saved 37 lives, and you did it in a way that's going to be talked about for the rest of Air Force history. Every pilot on this base is going to hear about Hog 27 and the single mom who flew into hell and came back out the other side." He stepped back and saluted, a gesture of respect between warriors. Raina returned it, her hand steady now, and as she did, she heard something that made her turn. The assembled crowd on the flight line was applauding, not cheering or whistling, but applauding with the slow, steady rhythm of people showing respect to someone who'd earned it through blood and fire. The debrief lasted until midnight, and by the time Raina was finally released, she was so exhausted she could barely walk. The intelligence officers had wanted every detail of her mission, every weapon emplacement she'd destroyed, every maneuver she'd made, every moment of the battle documented and analyzed. The maintenance officers had wanted to understand how her aircraft had survived the damage it had taken, what systems had failed, what had kept working, how they could apply those lessons to make the A-10 fleet even more survivable. The operations officers had wanted to understand her tactics, her decision-making process, what had given her the confidence to take on a mission that everyone else had considered impossible. Raina had answered their questions with patient precision, but all she really wanted was to get back to her quarters, hug her daughters, and sleep for about 16 hours straight. She walked through the dark base with her flight suit still reeking of smoke and sweat, her body aching in places she didn't know could ache, and tried to process what had happened. She'd spent her entire career fighting for respect, proving over and over that she deserved to be in the cockpit, that her gender didn't make her any less capable than the men she served with. Tonight she'd flown the mission that would define her career, the one that would follow her for the rest of her life, and she still wasn't sure how she felt about it. Proud, certainly. Relieved to be alive. But also aware that she'd gotten lucky, that the difference between heroism and tragedy was often just a matter of inches and seconds, and that dozens of small decisions had all gone right when any one of them could have gone wrong. Her quarters were dark when she arrived, but she could see a light under the door, and when she opened it, her two daughters were sitting on her bunk, still awake despite the late hour, watched over by the neighbor who'd been babysitting them. The girls launched themselves at her with shrieks of delight, and Raina caught them both, pulled them close, and buried her face in their hair. They smelled like shampoo and childhood, like everything good in the world, and she held them for a long moment before pulling back to look at them. Her oldest daughter, Leilani, had her father's serious eyes. Her youngest, Kiana, had Raina's stubborn chin. Both of them were looking at her with concern now, picking up on the signals that adults always thought they were hiding but children always saw. "Mommy, you smell like smoke," Leilani said. "Are you okay? We heard people talking about a pilot who did something brave." Raina smiled and smoothed her daughter's hair. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I just had a long day at work, but I'm home now and that's what matters." Kiana grabbed her hand. "Did you help people today, Mommy?" Raina thought about 37 Marines huddled on a rocky outcrop, thought about the sound of her cannon fire echoing off the mountains, thought about all the enemies who wouldn't be going home to their families because she'd been better at her job than they'd been at theirs. War was never simple, and heroism always came with a cost, but right now, looking at her daughters' faces, she could give them an answer that was true without being complicated. "Yes, baby. I helped some people who really needed it. Now let's get you two to bed. It's way past your bedtime." She tucked them in, told them stories until they fell asleep, and then finally allowed herself to sit down and stop moving for the first time in 18 hours. The knock on her door came just as she was considering whether she had the energy to shower or if she should just collapse into bed smelling like a house fire. She opened it to find a young airman standing there, holding a phone with an expression that suggested he'd drawn the short straw for this particular duty. "Captain Cahill, I'm sorry to disturb you, ma'am, but there's a call for you. It's from the States. They said it's important." Raina took the phone, wondering who could possibly be calling her at this hour, and heard a voice that made her stand up straighter despite her exhaustion. "Captain Cahill, this is Major General Brennan. I'm calling from the Pentagon and I wanted to speak with you personally about what happened today." Raina's mind went into overdrive. Generals didn't call captains unless something had gone very right or very wrong, and she wasn't sure which category tonight's mission fell into. "Yes, sir. I'm here." Brennan's voice was warm, almost grandfatherly. "Captain, I've been reading the mission reports, and I've been talking to the Marines you saved. Every single one of them asked me to thank you personally. They said you flew into a situation that should have been impossible and made it look routine. They said you stayed on station even after taking battle damage that would have sent most pilots running for home. They said you're the reason 37 families aren't going to get a knock on their door from a casualty notification officer." Raina felt her throat tighten again. "Sir, I was just doing what any A-10 pilot would do. Close air support is our mission." Brennan chuckled softly. "Captain, I've been in this business for 40 years, and I can count on one hand the number of pilots who would have done what you did tonight. You're going to be recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and between you and me, there are people pushing for something even more significant." The words took a moment to sink in. The Distinguished Flying Cross was one of the highest awards for aviators, given for heroism or extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. It was the kind of medal that defined careers, that marked someone as exceptional among the already exceptional people who wore Air Force Blue. "Sir, I don't know what to say." Brennan's voice became more serious. "You don't have to say anything, Captain. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep flying that hog. Keep protecting Marines. And know that people at the highest levels of command are aware of your service and grateful for it." The call ended, and Raina stood there in her small quarters, holding the phone and trying to process the surreal nature of the last 12 hours. She'd woken up this morning as just another pilot on crew rest, planning to spend the day reading stories to her daughters and maybe catching up on sleep. She was ending the day as someone who'd saved 37 lives, destroyed an enemy force, and earned the attention of generals at the Pentagon. The whiplash was enough to make her dizzy. She finally managed to shower, washing away the smoke and sweat and cordite residue that clung to her skin, and crawled into bed next to her sleeping daughters. As she drifted off to sleep, her last conscious thought was about her father and about whether he would be proud of what she'd done. She hoped so. She really hoped so. The dreams, when they came, were full of mountains and fire and the sound of her cannon, but underneath it all was the voice of the Marine she'd saved, saying words that would echo in her memory for years to come. "You're a goddamn angel." The story of Hog 27 and the single mom who'd flown into hell spread through the military community faster than Raina could have imagined possible. By the next morning, every pilot at Bagram knew what had happened. By the afternoon, the story had reached other air bases across Afghanistan. Within a week, it was being discussed in ready rooms and officers' clubs across the entire Air Force, each retelling adding new details, some true and some embellished, but all capturing the essential truth that something extraordinary had happened in a valley in the Hindu Kush. Raina tried to stay focused on her normal duties, but it was impossible to escape the attention. Pilots who'd previously been cordial but distant now went out of their way to talk to her. Ground crews who serviced her aircraft treated it with extra care, as if the Warthog itself had become legendary through association with her mission. Even the Marines on base looked at her differently now, with a respect that transcended branch rivalries. She got a letter from one of the Marines she'd saved, a corporal named Rodriguez who wrote in careful handwriting about how he'd been certain he was going to die in that valley, how he'd made his peace with it, and how the sound of her cannon fire had been the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. He enclosed a picture of his 3-year-old daughter, and wrote that he'd told her about the Air Force pilot who'd given him the chance to come home and be her father. Raina kept the letter in her locker and read it sometimes when the weight of what she did for a living became too heavy. 2 weeks after the mission, her A-10 was declared fully repaired and returned to flight status. The maintenance crews had worked around the clock to fix the damage, replacing an engine, patching hundreds of holes, repairing hydraulic lines and flight control surfaces, and all the other systems that had been damaged or destroyed. They'd also added something new to the aircraft's nose, just below the canopy: 37 small bombs painted in precise detail, one for each Marine she'd saved, a traditional way of marking significant missions. The crew chief who'd supervised the repairs walked Raina around the aircraft before her first post-mission flight, pointing out everything they'd fixed, everything they'd replaced, and finally showed her the bomb markings with visible pride. "She's as good as new, ma'am." Better than new, actually, because now she's got a reputation to live up to. Raina ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the smooth metal where patches had been welded in place. "She's a good bird. She brought me home when she had every reason to fall out of the sky." The crew chief nodded solemnly. "That's what hogs do, ma'am. They keep flying when everything else would quit, kind of like they're pilots." Raina flew her first mission the next day, a routine patrol that felt almost anticlimactic after the intensity of the rescue mission. But as she climbed out over the mountains, feeling the familiar controls under her hands, the reassuring growl of her engines, she realized that this was actually exactly what she needed. A reminder that most missions were routine, that most days didn't end with medal recommendations and calls from generals, that the job was about steady competence and professionalism rather than dramatic heroics. She checked in with ground controllers, ran her patrol sector, saw nothing that required engagement, and returned to base having accomplished exactly nothing of apparent significance. It was perfect, but she also knew that her life had changed in fundamental ways that she was still processing. She was no longer just another pilot. She was the pilot who'd done the impossible, and that came with expectations and pressures that she hadn't experienced before. 3 months after the mission, Raina stood in a ceremony room at Bagram, surrounded by her squadron mates and senior officers, while Lieutenant Colonel Vickers read the citation for her Distinguished Flying Cross. The words felt strange in their formality, describing her actions in the kind of stilted military language that somehow never quite captured what combat actually felt like. For extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. Displaying outstanding airmanship and extraordinary courage, disregarding her own safety to accomplish the mission, in keeping with the highest traditions of military service. The medal itself was beautiful, a bronze cross with a propeller in the center, hanging from a ribbon striped in blue and red. Vickers pinned it to her uniform, and Raina saluted, standing at attention while people applauded. Her daughters were there, brought in for the ceremony, both of them wearing matching dresses and looking slightly overwhelmed by the formality of it all. Afterward, when the official part was over and people were milling around with coffee and cookies, Leilani tugged on her sleeve. "Mommy, does this mean you're famous?" Raina knelt down to her daughter's level, thinking about how to answer honestly without making it seem like any of this was more important than it really was. "It means I did something good and people noticed, but famous? No, sweetheart, I'm just a pilot who did her job." Kiana wasn't having it. She crossed her arms in a gesture that was pure Raina. "You save people, Mommy. That's not just a job, that's being a hero." Raina pulled both her daughters close, breathing in their scent, feeling their warmth, and realized that they were right in a way she hadn't fully acknowledged. What she'd done that night in the valley wasn't just a job. It was the culmination of everything she'd worked for, everything she'd believed about the importance of being the person who could make a difference when it mattered most. The final piece of the story came 4 months later, when Raina received orders to return to the States for a new assignment. She was being posted to the Air Force Weapons School as an instructor, teaching the next generation of A-10 pilots how to survive in combat and accomplish the mission no matter what got thrown at them. It was one of the most prestigious assignments a fighter pilot could receive, reserved for the very best, the ones who'd proven themselves in combat and had the knowledge and skill to pass on to others. Her last day at Bagram was bittersweet. She walked out to her A-10 one final time, the aircraft she'd flown through so many missions, the one that had carried her into the valley and brought her home despite being shot full of holes. Someone had added one more marking to the nose, a small painted figure of a Hawaiian woman standing beside the bomb count, tiny but distinct, a permanent reminder of who had sat in this cockpit and what she'd accomplished. Raina traced the figure with one finger and smiled. The crew chief who'd shown her the bomb markings 4 months earlier was there, and he grinned at her. "Figured she deserved something to remember you by, ma'am. So did we." She shook his hand, feeling the calluses that came from years of working on aircraft in harsh conditions. "Take care of her, she's special." He nodded seriously. "We know, ma'am. Any pilot who flies her from now on is going to hear about Hog 27 and the mission. It's part of her history now, part of her legend." Raina walked away from the aircraft, collected her daughters from their temporary school, and caught the transport flight that would begin their journey home. As the C-17 climbed out of Bagram, she looked down at the mountains where she'd fought her most important battle, and thought about all the ways that one night had changed her life. The thing about legends, Raina learned over the following years, was that they had a way of growing beyond the people who inspired them. The story of the single mom who flew an A-10 into impossible odds and saved 37 Marines became a story that the Air Force told to recruits, A story that instructors used to teach about courage and competence. A story that parents told their daughters about women who broke barriers and proved that determination mattered more than demographics. Raina herself became something of a legend, though she never quite got comfortable with the attention. At the weapons school, she taught hundreds of pilots the skills they'd need to survive in combat, passing on lessons that had been written in fire and blood in a valley in Afghanistan. She was tough on her students, demanding excellence and accepting nothing less, but she was also patient and thorough, making sure they understood not just how to do things but why those techniques worked. Her students called her ma'am to her face and the Terminator behind her back, though it was said with respect rather than fear. She had a reputation for being able to fly an A-10 through situations that would defeat anyone else, and for pushing her students to be better than they thought they could be. Some of them washed out of her course, unable to meet her standards. Most of them graduated with a profound appreciation for what it took to be truly excellent at close air support, and a role model who'd shown them what was possible when skill met courage. Years passed. Raina was promoted to major, then lieutenant colonel. Her daughters grew up on Air Force bases, hearing stories about their moms flying from pilots who'd served with her, developing a matter-of-fact acceptance that their mother was kind of a big deal in military aviation circles. Leilani eventually joined the Air Force herself, though she became an engineer rather than a pilot, while Kiana went into medicine and became a trauma surgeon. Both of them, when asked about their mother, would smile and say that they'd learned from the best about how to stay calm under pressure and do the job no matter what. 20 years after the mission in the Valley, now Colonel Raina Cahill stood in the audience at the Air Force Academy, watching a new class of cadets receive their assignments. She'd been invited to give the graduation address, though she tried to decline, feeling like she'd already said everything she had to say through her years of teaching. But they'd insisted, and so here she was, preparing to tell her story one more time to a group of young people who'd been children when she'd flown into the Hindu Kush. When she took the podium, she looked out at hundreds of faces, saw the eagerness and determination and fear that every new officer carried with them, and decided to be honest in a way she rarely was about that night. 20 years ago, she began, I was a captain who'd spent her entire career fighting for the right to be treated as just another pilot. I dealt with skepticism, with doubt, with people who thought that being a single mom meant I'd lost my edge or wasn't fully committed to the mission. And then one day I heard Marines calling for help, and I had a choice to make. She paused, collecting her thoughts. I could play it safe. I could follow doctrine and wait for more assets to arrive. I could do everything by the book and let someone else take the risk. Or I could get in my A-10 and go help those Marines, even though the situation looked impossible and everyone thought I was crazy for trying. I chose to go, not because I was brave or special, but because I knew something that I want all of you to understand as you start your careers. The hall was completely silent now, every cadet focused on her words. The thing I knew was this: competence is the greatest equalizer. It doesn't matter what you look like, where you came from, or what anyone thinks about whether you belong in the job you're doing. When the moment comes, when people are depending on you, all that matters is whether you can do what needs to be done. I saved 37 Marines that night, not because I was a woman or because I was a single mom or because I had something to prove. I saved them because I was a damn good A-10 pilot who'd spent years becoming excellent at my job, and when the moment came, that excellence was enough. She looked around the hall, seeing faces that reflected the diversity of the modern Air Force, cadets of every background and identity, all of them about to embark on careers where they'd face their own challenges and doubts. Some of you will face skepticism about whether you belong in your career fields. Some of you will be told, directly or indirectly, that people like you don't succeed in the roles you've chosen. Some of you will have moments where you doubt yourselves, where you wonder if the skeptics are right. When those moments come, remember this: the answer to doubt is competence. Become so good at what you do that the question of whether you belong becomes irrelevant. Learn your job inside and out. Master your craft. Be the person that everyone else wants on their team when things get difficult. And when your moment comes, when people are depending on you, you'll be ready. She stepped back from the podium to applause that started slowly and then built to something like thunder. And as she walked off the stage, she thought about the young captain who'd climbed into a shot-up A-10 20 years ago, scared but determined, and how that moment had defined not just her career but her entire approach to life. The decades that followed saw Raina continue to serve, though she eventually transitioned from active flying to senior leadership positions where she could shape Air Force policy and culture. She became a vocal advocate for judging people on their performance rather than their demographics, for creating systems that rewarded competence over conformity, for building an air force that made room for people from all backgrounds to excel at the jobs they loved. She retired as a brigadier general, one of the few women to achieve flag rank in the combat aviation community, though she insisted that her rank was less important than the thousands of pilots she'd trained and mentored over her career. At her retirement ceremony, held at Nellis Air Force Base, where she'd spent so many years teaching at the weapons school, the speaker was a Marine colonel named Rodriguez. He was older now, grayer, but when he walked to the podium, Raina recognized him immediately as the corporal who'd sent her the letter and the picture of his daughter all those years ago. Rodriguez spoke about the night in the valley, about hearing her voice on the radio, about watching her A-10 dive through anti-aircraft fire that should have killed her a dozen times over. He spoke about the sound of her cannon, about the way the enemy had broken and run when she'd refused to quit, about the moment when he'd realized he was going to survive to see his daughter again. "General Cahill gave me a gift that night," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "She gave me my future. Every day I've spent with my family, every moment I've had with my daughter and now my grandchildren, every sunrise I've seen and every sunset I've enjoyed, all of it is because one Air Force pilot decided that 37 Marines she'd never met were worth flying into hell to save." He paused and looked directly at Raina. "Ma'am, I've spent 20 years trying to find a way to adequately thank you, and I've never succeeded. So I'll just say this. You are the reason I'm alive. You are the reason 36 other Marines went home to their families. And you are a genuine American hero, whether you're comfortable with that title or not." The standing ovation lasted several minutes, and Raina stood at attention throughout it, her eyes dry but her throat tight with emotion. When it finally ended, and she was allowed to speak, she took a moment to collect herself before addressing the assembled crowd. "Thank you, Colonel Rodriguez. Hearing those words from you means more than any medal or promotion ever could. But I need to say something about this hero business, because I think we sometimes misunderstand what heroism actually is." She looked around the room, seeing faces of pilots she'd trained, officers she'd mentored, enlisted crew members who'd kept her aircraft flying through countless missions. Heroism isn't about being fearless or superhuman. It's about being terrified and doing the job anyway. It's about knowing the risks and accepting them because someone else needs help, and you're the one who can provide it. The night I flew into that valley, I was scared. My hands were shaking when I started my engine. I knew the odds weren't good, but I also knew that 37 Marines were going to die if someone didn't help them, and I had an A-10 and the training to use it effectively. So I went, not because I was special, but because it was my job. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The real heroes are the Marines who held their ground for 6 hours against overwhelming odds. The real heroes are the ground crews who kept my aircraft flying mission after mission. The real heroes are the instructors who taught me how to fly, the engineers who designed the A-10 to be nearly indestructible, and every person who's ever put on a uniform and said, "I'll stand between my country and danger." I just happened to be the one in the cockpit that particular night. The retirement ceremony ended with the traditional final flight, though at Raina's rank and age, it was a symbolic gesture rather than actual combat flying. She strapped into an A-10 one last time, felt the familiar controls under her hands, heard the growl of the engines that had been the soundtrack to so much of her adult life, and took off into the Nevada sky. The flight lasted 30 minutes, a simple pattern around the airspace near Nellie's, but it felt like saying goodbye to an old friend, a partner who'd carried her through danger and brought her home more times than she could count. When she landed for the last time, there was a water cannon salute waiting, two fire trucks spraying arcs of water over her aircraft as she taxied in, a traditional honor for a pilot's final flight. She shut down the engines, went through the post-flight checklist one last time, and climbed out of the cockpit for the last time. The crew chief waiting for her was young enough to be her grandson, but he saluted with the crisp precision of someone who knew exactly who he was servicing. "General Cahill, it's been an honor to crew your final flight, ma'am." Raina returned the salute and then offered her hand to shake. "The honor was mine, Airman. Take care of these hogs. They're special." He grinned. "We know, ma'am. You made sure everyone knows." Raina walked away from the A-10, her flying career officially over, and found herself thinking not about the dramatic rescue mission that had defined her public reputation, but about all the quiet flights, the routine patrols, the training missions where she'd passed on her knowledge to the next generation. Those were the flights that had really mattered, the ones that had built the foundation of competence that had made the heroic moment possible. The story doesn't really end with Raina's retirement, because stories like hers never truly end. They become part of the institutional memory of an organization, woven into the culture and passed down through generations. Today, every new A-10 pilot learns about Hog 27 during their training. They study the mission as a case study in close air support, analyzing her tactics and decision-making. They learn about the A-10's legendary durability through the documented damage her aircraft sustained and still managed to fly home. They learn about courage and competence through her example. Her daughters, now middle-aged women with children of their own, sometimes get asked what it was like growing up with a mother who was an Air Force legend. Their answers vary depending on the audience, but the truth is usually some version of the same theme. She was just mom, making them breakfast before school, helping with homework, attending recitals and sports games, living the same chaotic life that every working parent lives. The fact that her job involved flying through enemy fire was just one aspect of who she was, not the sum total of her identity. The Marines she saved stayed in touch over the years, forming a bond that transcended the usual boundaries of military service. They had reunions every few years, gathering with their families to remember the night they'd all survived together. Raina usually attended when she could, though she always felt slightly awkward being treated as the guest of honor at gatherings celebrating a night when she'd simply done her job. But she went anyway, because these men had earned the right to commemorate their survival however they chose, and if that meant toasting the crazy pilot who'd refused to let them die, she could endure the embarrassment. At one of these reunions, held 25 years after the mission, an aging Rodriguez pulled her aside for a private conversation. His hair was white now, and he moved with the careful precision of someone whose body carried old wounds, but his eyes were still sharp. "General, I wanted to show you something." He pulled out his phone and showed her a picture of a young woman in an Air Force uniform, standing in front of a T-38 trainer jet. "That's my granddaughter. She starts pilot training next month. She wants to fly A-10s, and when people ask her why, she tells them about the night her grandpa was saved by a pilot who flew into impossible odds because Marines needed help." Raina looked at the picture, seeing determination and intelligence in the young woman's face, and felt something shift in her chest. "She's going to be great. Make sure she knows that pilot training is going to be the hardest thing she's ever done, but it's worth it." Rodriguez nodded. "I will. But I also wanted to say something I've never quite managed to put into words before. That night in the valley when we heard your voice on the radio, it wasn't just about being rescued. It was about knowing that someone cared enough to come for us, that we hadn't been forgotten or written off. You gave us hope when hope seemed impossible, and that's a gift that's impossible to repay." Raina felt her eyes sting and blinked hard. "Colonel, you repaid it by living good lives, by being there for your families, by raising children and grandchildren who are making the world better. That's all any of us can do. We take the chances we're given and we make the most of them." The years continued to pass, as they always do, and Raina settled into retirement with the slightly bemused air of someone who'd spent so long being busy that idleness felt unnatural. She consulted for aerospace companies, served on advisory boards, gave occasional speeches at military events, and spent time with her grandchildren, teaching them about flight and physics and the importance of being competent at whatever they chose to do with their lives. She also wrote a book, though she resisted the project for years before finally agreeing. It wasn't about the rescue mission, though that was included. Instead, it was about the long process of becoming excellent at a difficult job, about the unsexy work of studying and training and practicing that made heroic moments possible. The title was simple: Hog Driver, Lessons from the Cockpit. It became required reading at the Air Force Academy and the Weapons School, not because it was full of dramatic stories, though those were present, but because it was honest about what it took to be truly good at a demanding profession. One reviewer called it the best book ever written about the relationship between competence and courage, and Raina considered that the highest compliment she'd ever received. Late in life, well into her 70s, Raina was invited to speak at a ceremony dedicating a new A-10 training simulator at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, the home of the A-10 community. The simulator was state-of-the-art, capable of replicating every aspect of flying the Warthog, and it was being named in her honor, the Cahill Close Air Support Training System. She stood in front of the simulator, looking at her name on the plaque, and felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. The base commander, a colonel young enough to have been born after her famous mission, gave a speech about her legacy and her impact on the A-10 community. Then he invited her to say a few words, and Raina found herself facing an audience that included current A-10 pilots, students in training, maintenance crews, and a surprising number of veterans who'd flown or worked on Warthogs over the decades. "I'm honored by this recognition," she began, "though I have to admit it feels strange to have my name on a piece of equipment. But if this simulator helps train the next generation of A-10 pilots, if it helps them learn the skills they need to protect people on the ground and come home safely, then it's serving the most important purpose any tool can serve." She paused, gathering her thoughts. The A-10 community has always been special. We fly an airplane that other pilots make fun of, calling it ugly and slow and outdated. We specialize in a mission that puts us closer to the enemy than anyone else wants to be. We work in an environment where mistakes are measured in friendly casualties and success is measured in lives saved rather than targets destroyed. It's demanding and dangerous and absolutely essential. She looked around the room, seeing the faces of people who'd chosen the same difficult path she'd walked decades earlier. To everyone here who flies or maintains or supports the Warthog, you're part of something important. Every mission you fly, every time you put steel on target to protect people on the ground, you're carrying on a tradition that goes back to the very beginning of military aviation. You're the guardian angels of soldiers and Marines in contact with the enemy. You're the voice on the radio that says, "Help is here," when everything seems lost. Never forget how important that is. The ceremony ended with a flyover by 4 A-10s, flying in the missing man formation to honor not just Raina, but all the Warthog pilots who'd flown into danger and not come home. Raina stood at attention, saluting as the aircraft roared overhead, their distinctive profile unmistakable even at distance, and felt tears on her cheeks for the first time in years. She thought about her father, dead in Beirut before she could remember him, and wondered if he was proud of what she'd become. She thought about the Marines she'd saved, scattered now across the country but forever linked by one night in the Hindu Kush. She thought about the students she'd trained, hundreds of pilots who were now out there flying missions and protecting people because she'd taught them how. And she thought about her daughters and grandchildren, who'd grown up watching her prove that women could fly combat aircraft as well as anyone, that being a mother wasn't incompatible with being a warrior, that competence was the only qualification that really mattered. The sun was setting over Arizona, painting the sky in shades that reminded her of that long-ago evening when she'd climbed into a battle-damaged A-10 and coaxed it home through sheer will and skill. The sky had been the same then, blood orange and deep purple, and she'd been young and scared and determined to survive. Now she was old and honored and satisfied with the life she'd lived, but the sky was still the same, still beautiful, still the domain where she'd found her purpose and her passion. Someone came up beside her as the ceremony broke up, and she turned to see Rodriguez, even older now, leaning on a cane but still present, still bearing witness. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I've been to a lot of military ceremonies in my life, but this one feels different. This one feels like the Air Force finally recognizing what we've known all along. You changed the game. You showed what's possible when skill meets courage." Raina shook her head gently. "Colonel, I was just one pilot among thousands. The real heroes are the ones who do the job every day without recognition, who fly the missions that never make the news, who come home to their families and do it all again the next day. That simulator in there, it's not about honoring me. It's about making sure the next generation is ready when their moment comes." Rodriguez smiled. "That's exactly why you deserve the honor, ma'am, because you never wanted it, because you always saw it as just doing the job. That's what made you special." They stood together in comfortable silence, two old warriors watching the sun set over an Air Force base, surrounded by the sounds of aircraft in training and the eternal rhythm of military life. And if the radio had been quiet for a moment, listening to their shared memory of a night 25 years past, it was a silence full of respect and remembrance, and the knowledge that some stories, some missions, echo across the decades and define not just the people who lived them but everyone who comes after. The legacy of Hog 27 wasn't just about one dramatic rescue. It was about every pilot who looked at a difficult situation and decided to try anyway. It was about every person who proved that competence transcends demographics. It was about the eternal truth that when people need help, the only thing that matters is whether someone capable is willing to answer the call. And on that evening in Arizona, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, that legacy felt very much alive.